Welcome, sailor. This is the story of a seasoned diver who thought he'd seen it all, until the seafloor cracked open beneath him. What began as a routine inspection dive off a remote oil platform became a waking nightmare 80 feet below, with vanishing visibility, collapsing steel, and a crewmate who never surfaced. He had minutes to survive, or join the silence of the deep.
My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I've been a commercial diver for 12 years. I've worked everything from bridge inspections in the Hudson River to underwater welding on Gulf of Mexico rigs. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on the Gulf Navigator that October morning, 43 miles southeast of Galveston, Texas. People always ask me what it's like down there, 80 feet below the surface, where sunlight fades to a dim green glow and the only sounds are your own breathing and the steady hum of machinery filtering air through your umbilical. It's a world most people will never see, a place where steel and concrete meet the endless patience of salt water, where every weld, every bolt, every structural connection fights a losing battle against corrosion and time. I'd been diving these Gulf waters since 2011, when the oil industry was still recovering from the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Back then, safety protocols were religion, and veteran captains like Jake Morrison were the high priests of that faith. Morrison had been running commercial diving operations for over 20 years, and his reputation wasn't just legendary, it was literally written into contracts. Oil companies specifically requested his services because in 2 decades of offshore operations, he'd never lost a diver. That morning, as we steamed toward Platform Delta 7, I had no idea I was about to become the exception that would haunt his perfect record forever. The Gulf Navigator cut through the pre-dawn darkness of the Gulf of Mexico like a floating city of purpose and precision. At 110 feet long and equipped with state-of-the-art dive support systems, she was one of the finest commercial diving vessels operating in these waters. Her twin diesels hummed with mechanical confidence as we approached Platform Delta 7, and the smell of coffee mixed with diesel exhaust filled the crisp October air. I'd been awake since 0430, going through my pre-dive equipment checks with the methodical precision that keeps commercial divers alive. My Kirby Morgan diving helmet, a $15,000 piece of life support equipment, sat on the bench like a metallic skull, its faceplate reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the dive locker. The Superlight SL-17B was my second helmet in 12 years of diving. The first one had saved my life during a pipeline inspection gone wrong in 2018, when a section of 30-inch pipe shifted unexpectedly and nearly crushed me against the seafloor. Captain Morrison was already on the bridge when I made my way topside with my first cup of coffee. At 54 years old, Jake Morrison looked exactly like Central Casting would order for a Gulf Coast dive boat captain. Weathered face marked by decades of sun and salt spray, thick forearms covered in faded tattoos that told stories of ports from Galveston to Mobile, and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of wind, weather, and water conditions simultaneously. "Morning, Rodriguez," he called down from the bridge wing. "Looks like we caught a perfect weather window. Seas are running less than 2 feet, visibility should be good down there." The morning briefing took place in the vessel's main salon, where Morrison spread out the charts and engineering drawings that would guide our work. Platform Delta 7 was what the industry called a legacy structure, built in 1987 during the height of Gulf oil production, now showing the inevitable signs of 3.5 decades of saltwater exposure and hurricane seasons. "We've got reports of possible stress fractures on the northwest support leg," Morrison explained, his finger tracing the platform's structural diagram. The platform owner spotted some surface corrosion during their last inspection, but they need a commercial diver to get down there and see what's happening below the waterline. My dive partner for the day was Tommy Chin, 24 years old and originally from Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. Tommy had grown up around the water. His family had been shrimpers for 3 generations before Hurricane Katrina changed everything and he'd ended up in the oil patch. Despite having only 3 years of commercial diving experience, Tommy had solid instincts and the kind of calm demeanor that made him a good partner in the compressed, high-stakes world of underwater industrial work. "You nervous about this one?" Tommy asked as we suited up in our diving gear. "Nah," I replied, adjusting the shoulder straps on my diving harness. "Routine inspection dive. We'll be down there maybe 45 minutes, document whatever we find, back on the surface before lunch." Famous last words. The diving equipment we used represented the cutting edge of commercial diving technology. Our dry suits were custom-fitted Viking Pro suits rated for 200-foot depths, with integrated heating systems powered by hot water circulated from the surface. The umbilicals that connected us to the Gulf Navigator were marvels of engineering, quarter-inch steel-reinforced hoses that simultaneously supplied breathing gas, hot water for suit heating and communication lines, while also serving as our primary connection to the surface in case of emergency. Platform Delta 7 rose from the Gulf waters like a rusty cathedral, its legs disappearing into the green-blue depths below. These structures always impressed me with their sheer audacity. The idea that human engineers could design something to withstand hurricane-force winds, 20-foot seas, and the relentless corrosion of salt water for decades was either brilliant or insane, depending on your perspective. At exactly 0800 hours, Tommy and I performed our final equipment checks and rolled backward off the Gulf Navigator's dive platform into the Gulf of Mexico. The water temperature was 74 degrees Fahrenheit, comfortable for October diving, and visibility looked good from the surface. The descent was textbook perfect. Commercial diving isn't the recreational scuba diving most people imagine. We don't swim around admiring fish and coral. We drop straight down following a weighted shot line, equalizing our ears every few feet, until we reach the working depth. At 60 feet, the natural sunlight began to fade, and we switched on our underwater lighting systems. At 70 feet, the platform's massive support structure came into view through the green water. Navigator base, this is Rodriguez, I called through my comm system. On bottom at 82 feet depth. Beginning visual inspection of northwest support structure. Morrison's voice came back clear and professional. Copy that, Rodriguez. You're cleared to begin inspection. Weather topside is holding steady. The seafloor around platform Delta 7 was typical Gulf bottom. Sandy sediment mixed with shell fragments, scattered debris from decades of platform operations, and the occasional fish seeking shelter in the artificial reef created by the structure's legs. But as I approached the northwest support leg, something looked wrong. The sediment around the base of the platform leg appeared disturbed, as if something had been shifting the bottom recently. In 12 years of diving, I'd learned to pay attention to details that seemed out of place. The Gulf seafloor doesn't change much from day to day, so when something looks different, there's usually a reason. The support leg itself showed the expected signs of age and corrosion. The original protective coating had long since failed, and layers of marine growth covered much of the steel surface. But as I began documenting the condition with my underwater camera, I found the reported stress fractures, and they were worse than anyone had suspected. What should have been hairline cracks were actually significant fractures running through critical weld joints. The steel was literally pulling apart under stresses it had withstood for over 30 years. I'd seen similar failures before, usually the result of metal fatigue combined with the constant motion of waves and currents. But these cracks looked different. They looked recent. Navigator base, the reported cracks are more extensive than documented. I radioed topside. I'm seeing significant structural damage that's going to require immediate attention. That's when I felt the first vibration. It started as a barely perceptible tremor transmitted through the water, the kind of sensation you might dismiss as machinery noise from the platform above. But commercial divers learn to distinguish between normal industrial sounds and something that shouldn't be there. This felt wrong. Navigator base, are you showing any unusual activity on the platform? I asked. Morrison's voice came back with a slight edge of concern. Negative, Rodriguez. Platform operations are normal. What are you seeing down there? Before I could answer, the vibration increased dramatically. Through the water, I could hear the deep groaning sound of steel under stress. A sound that every commercial diver learns to fear because it usually means something very large and very heavy is about to move in ways it wasn't designed to move. Tommy, you feeling this? I called to my dive partner who was working about 20 feet away. Yeah, man. What the hell is that? The answer came 30 seconds later, when seismic monitoring equipment aboard the Gulf Navigator registered what would later be classified as a magnitude 3.2 earthquake with its epicenter approximately 2 miles northeast of platform Delta 7. In most parts of the world, a 3.2 earthquake is barely noticeable. But when you're 80 feet underwater, attached to a 36-year-old offshore platform that's already showing signs of structural failure, even a minor seismic event can trigger catastrophic consequences. Rodriguez, we're showing seismic activity on our instruments. Morrison's voice crackled through my helmet speaker. Minor tremor, magnitude 3.2. Platform stability appears normal from our position. But platform stability wasn't normal at all. What Morrison couldn't see from the surface was what was happening to the seafloor beneath platform Delta 7. The earthquake had triggered something that geologists would later identify as localized seafloor subsidence, a phenomenon where underlying sediment layers shift and compact, causing the ocean bottom to literally sink. It's rare, unpredictable, and exactly the kind of event that turns routine industrial operations into maritime disasters. I watched in fascination and growing horror as a section of seafloor roughly 30 feet in diameter began to drop away beneath the platform's northwest support leg. It happened slowly at first, just a gradual settling that might have been caused by our activities stirring up the bottom. But within seconds, it accelerated into a full-scale geological collapse. Sediment clouds erupted from the seafloor like underwater tornadoes, reducing visibility from 60 feet to less than 10 feet in a matter of seconds. The massive steel support leg, suddenly unsupported along a significant portion of its base, began to tilt at an angle that sent stress fractures racing up its length like lightning. Platform Delta 7, which had withstood Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, and countless Gulf storms, was beginning to collapse. The sound of a 5,000-ton offshore platform beginning to fail is something you feel as much as hear. Through the water, the groaning and shrieking of overstressed steel created a symphony of mechanical agony that seemed to vibrate through every bone in my body. As the northwest support leg tilted beyond its design limits, the entire platform structure began to redistribute loads in ways it was never engineered to handle. Debris started raining down through the murky water. Chunks of concrete that had been blown off corroded surfaces, pieces of piping that had finally succumbed to metal fatigue, sections of grating and walkway that couldn't handle the shifting stresses. Each piece of falling debris represented a potential death sentence for divers working below, and Tommy and I were directly in the impact zone. Navigator base. Navigator base. I shouted into my communication system, fighting to keep my voice professional despite the adrenaline surge that was making my hands shake. We have major structural failure occurring down here. The northwest support leg is collapsing. Morrison's response came immediately. Rodriguez, get you and Chin to the shot line now. Emergency ascent procedures, go. But emergency ascent procedures assume you can see your shot line, and the sediment cloud stirred up by the seafloor collapse had reduced underwater visibility to virtually zero. I could barely see my own hands in front of my diving mask, much less locate the weighted rope that would guide us safely to the surface. Tommy? Tommy, where are you? I called through the diver-to-diver communication system. I can't see anything, Marcus. My umbilical's getting pulled around by the current. That's when the real nightmare began. As Platform Delta 7's support structure shifted and twisted, sections of the platform's lower framework, catwalks, pipe supports, equipment skids that had been installed over the decades, began breaking free and falling toward the seafloor. Most commercial divers have nightmares about getting trapped under falling debris, but this was beyond anything we'd trained for. This was an entire industrial facility disintegrating above our heads. A section of 8-inch pipeline easily weighing several tons crashed into the seafloor 15 feet from my position, sending up another cloud of sediment and creating an impact crater that I could feel through my boots. If that pipe had hit either Tommy or me directly, our diving suits and safety equipment would have provided about as much protection as tissue paper. Navigator base, we need immediate emergency support down here. I radioed, following my umbilical hand over hand in what I hoped was the direction of our shot line. We have major debris fall, zero visibility, and structural collapse ongoing. Morrison's voice came back, but I could hear something different in his tone, a strain that hadn't been there before. Rodriguez, stand by, something's. Jesus, I can't. Then silence. The communications link between the dive team and the surface had gone dead at the worst possible moment. Tommy and I were 80 feet underwater, in zero visibility, with an offshore platform collapsing above us, and we just lost contact with our surface support team. In commercial diving, your umbilical is your lifeline in the most literal sense possible. It supplies your breathing gas, your communications, your hot water for thermal protection, and serves as your primary navigation reference back to the surface. But umbilicals can be cut by falling debris, pinched by shifting structures, or simply torn apart by the kind of chaotic forces we were experiencing. Tommy, can you hear me? I called through the water, hoping our diver-to-diver comms were still functional. I can hear you, but I can't see shit. Something big just came down right next to me. I made a decision that probably saved both our lives. Instead of trying to navigate back to our original shot line, which might have been destroyed or blocked by debris, I began following my umbilical directly back toward the surface. Commercial diving umbilicals are designed to handle significant stress, and as long as the line held, it would lead me back to the Gulf Navigator. Tommy, forget the shot line. Follow your umbilical back to the boat. Hand over hand, don't let go. Got it? I'm following my line up. The ascent through the debris field was terrifying. Every few feet, I encountered pieces of the collapsing platform, twisted metal, concrete chunks, sections of pipe that had been ripped from their moorings. The sediment cloud extended all the way to about 40 feet depth, meaning we had to navigate purely by feel and instinct through the most dangerous part of the water column. At 60 feet depth, I began to see faint traces of natural light filtering down through the murky water. At 40 feet, the visibility finally began to improve enough that I could make out shapes and shadows above me. That's when I realized the full scope of what was happening on the surface. The Gulf Navigator was listing heavily to starboard, her hull tilted at an angle that immediately told me we had serious problems topside. Chunks of platform debris were floating on the surface around the vessel, and I could see damage to our starboard dive platform where falling steel had impacted the boat. But the most terrifying sight was Tommy's umbilical, floating free on the surface like a severed artery, its cut end telling me that my dive partner was no longer connected to life support from the surface. Navigator base, this is Rodriguez approaching the surface. I called through my comm system, praying that someone topside was still conscious and able to respond. I need immediate assistance. Chen's umbilical appears to be severed. The voice that answered wasn't Morrison's. It was Lisa Park, our 26-year-old dive tender, and I could hear barely controlled panic in her words. "Marcus, thank God you're alive. Captain Morrison collapsed about 20 minutes ago. We think it's his heart. He's unconscious and Jenny's working on him now." Tommy's line got cut by falling debris from the platform. We lost all contact with him. As I broke through to the surface and grabbed onto the Gulf Navigator's dive ladder, the full magnitude of our situation became clear. Morrison, the most experienced offshore captain I'd ever worked with, was down with what sounded like a heart attack. Tommy Chin, a young diver with his whole career ahead of him, was missing and probably dead somewhere in the debris field below. Platform Delta 7 was continuing to collapse, sending more steel and concrete crashing into the Gulf around us. And I, a commercial diver with zero command experience, was suddenly the most senior person conscious on a damaged vessel 43 miles from shore. "Lisa, help me get out of this gear," I shouted as I hauled myself onto the dive platform. "What's our status up here?" Lisa Park had been dive tending for less than 2 years, but she'd grown up in a Coast Guard family and had good instincts under pressure. Captain's in the wheelhouse with Jenny working on him. Mike's in the engine room checking for damage from the debris hits. We took some impacts on the starboard side, but no hull breaches that we can find. As I stripped out of my diving equipment, I could feel the Gulf Navigator moving differently in the water. The subtle changes in motion that indicated either damage or shifted weight distribution. Through the wheelhouse windows, I could see Jenny Walsh, our certified EMT, working over Morrison's unconscious form with the methodical efficiency that medical training provides in crisis situations. "Jenny?" I called as I climbed to the main deck. "How is he?" Jenny looked up from her patient, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool October air. Textbook heart attack symptoms. Blood pressure dropping, irregular pulse, but he's stable for now. I need to get him to a hospital within 6 hours, or we're going to lose him. 6 hours. Galveston was 43 nautical miles away, and I had no idea if the Gulf Navigator was even capable of making that journey with whatever damage she'd sustained. Mike Santos emerged from the engine room, wiping grease from his hands with a shop rag. Mike was our chief engineer, a solid, dependable guy who'd kept the vessel's mechanical systems running flawlessly for the past 3 years. "Marcus, we need to talk. The good news is both main engines are operational and we didn't lose any critical systems. The bad news is we took some significant impacts on the starboard hull, and we're taking on water in compartment 3. "How bad?" "Manageable with the bilge pumps, but it's something we need to monitor. Also, the debris damaged our GPS antenna and knocked out our primary navigation display. We've got backup systems, but..." He paused and looked at me with an expression that said everything. "Marcus, you ever piloted a vessel this size before?" The answer was no. In 12 years of commercial diving, I'd been a passenger on dozens of offshore vessels, but I'd never been responsible for actually operating one. I understood the basic principles of marine navigation, but there's a massive difference between understanding something intellectually and actually doing it when lives depend on your decisions. I looked around at the faces of the 5 crew members who were suddenly depending on me to get them home safely. Lisa Park, young and scared but trying to hide it behind professional competence. Mike Santos, solid and reliable but clearly worried about our mechanical situation. Jenny Walsh, focused on keeping Morrison alive but glancing at me with questions in her eyes. And 2 deckhands, Billy Tran and Carlos Mendez, who'd never faced anything worse than rough weather in their combined 8 years of offshore work. Platform Delta 7 continued to disintegrate behind us, each new collapse sending debris flying through the air and crashing into the gulf around us. Staying in this location was suicide, but attempting to navigate 43 miles of open ocean in a damaged vessel with an unconscious captain and a crew looking to me for leadership felt almost as dangerous. I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. We were leaving Tommy Chin behind. All hands listen up. I shouted over the sound of the collapsing platform. We're departing this location immediately. Billy, Carlos, secure all loose gear and prepare for rough weather operations. Lisa, get all dive equipment stowed and check our emergency supplies. Mike, I need a full engine status report and our best course back to Galveston. Jenny, how portable is the captain? Jenny looked up from her patient. I can move him if necessary, but I need to keep him on cardiac monitoring equipment. Any major movement could trigger another episode. Understood. We'll take it as easy as possible, but we need to get clear of this debris field before something else comes down on us. As the crew scattered to their emergency stations, I climbed to the bridge of the Gulf Navigator and faced the control station that Captain Morrison had operated with such casual expertise just hours before. The array of instruments, switches, and displays looked like the cockpit of a commercial airliner, intimidatingly complex and absolutely critical to our survival. Through the bridge windows, I could see the expanding debris field where Tommy Chen had disappeared. Somewhere in that underwater graveyard was a 24-year-old kid from Louisiana who trusted me to bring him home safe to his family. The rational part of my mind knew that staying to search for him would only risk more lives, but the guilt of abandoning a teammate would stay with me forever. I reached for the engine controls and realized my hands were shaking. 43 miles of Gulf of Mexico lay between us and safety, with a critically injured captain, a damaged vessel, and a crew depending on someone who'd never commanded anything larger than a pickup truck. But Tommy Chin was already gone, and 5 people who were still alive needed me to figure out how to get them home. Taking command of a 110-foot commercial vessel in an emergency isn't something they teach in commercial diving school. As I stood at the Gulf Navigator's control station, studying the bewildering array of gauges, switches, and navigation displays, I realized that everything I knew about boat operations came from 12 years of watching other people do the job. The first challenge was simply understanding what all the instruments were telling me. The main engine controls were straightforward enough. Throttle levers that controlled the twin diesel engines, similar to the controls on smaller boats I'd operated. But the navigation systems were a different story entirely. GPS plotters, radar displays, depth sounders, wind instruments, and compass systems all provided critical information that I needed to interpret correctly if we were going to make it safely back to Galveston. Mike, I need you up here, I called to our chief engineer. Walk me through the basics of what I'm looking at. Mike Santos climbed to the bridge and quickly assessed our situation. Okay, the good news is the navigation computer has our current position locked in, and I can program a course back to Galveston Harbor. The bad news is our primary GPS antenna got damaged, so we're running on backup systems that aren't as accurate. He pointed to the various displays around the control station. This is your radar. It'll show you other vessels, weather systems, and major navigation hazards. This is the chart plotter. Think of it like GPS for boats, showing your position relative to channels, shallow water, and other obstacles. These are your engine monitors: oil pressure, coolant temperature, RPM, fuel consumption. The fuel consumption display caught my attention immediately. At our current position, 43 nautical miles southeast of Galveston, we were burning approximately 25 gallons per hour per engine at cruising speed. With the Gulf Navigator's fuel capacity of 800 gallons, that gave us about 16 hours of operating time under normal conditions. More than enough for the 4-hour journey to port. But these weren't normal conditions. The damage we'd sustained from falling platform debris meant we were taking on water in one compartment, requiring continuous operation of bilge pumps that increased our electrical load and fuel consumption. More critically, the deteriorating weather conditions meant we'd have to push the engines harder than normal cruise settings to maintain headway against increasing seas. Mike, what's our maximum sustainable speed in these conditions? With the damage we've sustained? I'd say 8 knots maximum. Push her harder than that and we risk aggravating the hull damage or overstressing the engines. 8 knots. 43 nautical miles. Over 5 hours of travel time, assuming the weather didn't get worse and nothing else went wrong. Jenny Walsh's voice came from the wheelhouse. Marcus, I need to talk to you about the captain's condition. I left Mike at the controls and went to check on Morrison. He was unconscious but breathing regularly, connected to our portable cardiac monitor and receiving oxygen through a nasal cannula. Jenny had established in 4-line and was monitoring his vital signs with the professional competence that had made her invaluable as our onboard medic. "How is he really?" I asked quietly. "Honestly? He's stable now, but that could change quickly. Heart attacks are unpredictable, especially for someone his age who's been under this kind of stress. I can keep him comfortable and monitor his condition, but he needs advanced cardiac care that I can't provide out here." "How long do we have?" Jenny checked her watch and made some quick calculations. "If his condition remains stable, we should be okay for the next 6 to 8 hours. But if he goes into cardiac arrest or develops complications, all bets are off. I need to get him to a hospital as soon as possible." The radio crackled to life with a Coast Guard transmission. "Motor Vessel Gulf Navigator, Motor Vessel Gulf Navigator, this is Coast Guard Galveston. We have received reports of a platform emergency in your area. Please respond with your status and position." I keyed the microphone, grateful that at least our communications equipment was still functional. "Coast Guard Galveston, this is Motor Vessel Gulf Navigator. We have departed the platform Delta 7 area following structural collapse of the platform. We have 1 crew member missing, presumed lost, and 1 crew member with a medical emergency aboard. We are currently en route to Galveston Harbor requesting priority medical assistance." Gulf Navigator, Coast Guard Galveston. Copy your emergency status. What is the nature of the medical emergency? Coast Guard, we have a 54-year-old male with suspected myocardial infarction, currently unconscious but stable. We have a certified EMT aboard providing care, but we need immediate hospital facilities upon arrival. Gulf Navigator, understood. We are coordinating with EMS services for your arrival. What is your estimated time of arrival Galveston Harbor? I looked at Mike, who was plotting our course on the navigation system. He held up 5 fingers, then made a questioning gesture. Coast Guard, estimating 5 hours to Galveston Harbor, weather permitting. Gulf Navigator, copy 5 hours ETA. Be advised, weather conditions are deteriorating in your area. We show a cold front approaching from the northwest with winds increasing to 25 knots and seas building to 6 feet. Perfect. Not only were we attempting to navigate a damaged vessel with an inexperienced captain, but we were going to be doing it in increasingly rough conditions that would test both the boat's seaworthiness and my non-existent ship handling skills. The next 4 hours became a crash course in emergency seamanship. Mike Santos proved invaluable during the early stages of our journey, teaching me the basics of reading weather patterns on radar, adjusting our course to minimize the impact of building seas, and monitoring our mechanical systems for signs of trouble. The key to running in rough weather is finding the right balance between speed and comfort, Mike explained as we encountered our first set of 4-foot swells. Push too hard and you'll pound the hull to pieces. Go too slow and you lose steerage and get beaten up by the waves. Lisa Park had secured all the dive equipment and was helping Jenny monitor Morrison's condition. Despite her youth and relative inexperience, Lisa had grown up around boats and instinctively understood the rhythm of vessel operations in rough weather. She became my unofficial communications coordinator, managing radio traffic with the Coast Guard and keeping me updated on crew status throughout the vessel. "Marcus, the bilge pumps are keeping up with the water intrusion, but it's getting worse," Billy Tran reported from his inspection of the damaged compartment. "We're not in immediate danger, but we need to get to port before this gets out of hand." The weather continued to deteriorate as we pushed northeast toward the Texas coast. What had started as gentle 2-foot swells grew to 4 feet, then 6 feet, then 8-foot seas that had the Gulf Navigator pitching and rolling in ways that tested both the vessel's stability and my ability to maintain course and speed. "Coast Guard Galveston, this is Gulf Navigator," I radioed as we encountered our first set of really rough seas. "We are experiencing increasingly difficult conditions out here. Can you provide updated weather information for our route?" Gulf Navigator, Coast Guard Galveston. Be advised, cold front passage is occurring earlier than predicted. Winds are now 30 knots from the northwest, seas 6 to 8 feet and building. Conditions should moderate once the front passes, estimated 2 hours. 2 hours of 8-foot seas in a damaged vessel with a heart attack victim aboard. I was beginning to understand why commercial vessel captains spent years learning their trade before taking command responsibility. The real test came about 3 hours into our journey, when we encountered what mariners call confused seas, the chaotic wave conditions that occur when wind-driven waves meet swells from different directions. The Gulf Navigator began pitching and rolling with violent motions that threatened to tear loose anything that wasn't properly secured. "Jenny, how's the captain handling this rough stuff?" I called back to the wheelhouse. "Not well. The motion is affecting his blood pressure, and I'm worried about triggering another cardiac episode. I faced a decision that every ship captain learns to make: risk the vessel and crew by reducing speed to minimize motion, or risk the patient by maintaining speed to get to medical care faster. There's no textbook answer to that dilemma. It's a judgment call that depends on experience I didn't have. Mike, if we reduce speed to minimize the pitching, how much time does that add to our journey? Probably another hour, maybe more. But if we keep pounding through these seas at current speed, we risk opening up more hull damage or losing our engines to vibration stress. I made the call to reduce speed and accept the longer journey time. It was a decision based more on instinct than experience, but it felt right given our overall situation. The Gulf Navigator settled into a more comfortable motion, and Jenny reported that Morrison's vital signs had stabilized. But our problems were far from over. As we pushed through the rough weather, a new crisis developed that would test every skill I'd absorbed during 12 years of working offshore. The radar display, which had been functioning normally throughout our journey, suddenly began showing returns that didn't make sense. Multiple targets appeared to be converging on our position from the northeast. Targets that were moving too fast and in too organized a pattern to be other commercial vessels seeking shelter from the weather. Mike, take a look at this radar display. What do you make of those contacts? Mike studied the screen for several seconds before his expression grew serious. Marcus, those look like military vessels. Fast-moving, operating in formation. That's either Coast Guard cutters or Navy ships. The radio crackled with a transmission that confirmed our worst fears. Motor vessel Gulf Navigator, this is Coast Guard cutter Resolute. We are responding to reports of a missing crew member in the platform Delta 7 area. Heave to and prepare to be boarded for search and rescue coordination. I keyed the microphone with hands that were suddenly shaking again. Coast Guard cutter Resolute, this is Gulf Navigator. We have a medical emergency aboard and are proceeding to Galveston Harbor under emergency conditions. Our missing crew member was lost during platform collapse with no possibility of survival. Gulf Navigator, we understand your emergency status, but we are required to coordinate search and rescue operations for the missing crew member. Reduce speed and prepare for boarding. The moral complexity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. The Coast Guard was absolutely right to investigate Tommy Chen's disappearance and coordinate search efforts. But complying with their boarding request would add hours to our journey and potentially cost Jake Morrison his life. More critically, I knew with absolute certainty that Tommy was dead. No one could have survived the platform collapse and debris field we'd escaped. I made a decision that went against every instinct of cooperation with maritime authority, but which I believed was necessary to save the life of the man who'd been my captain and mentor for 3 years. Coast Guard cutter Resolute, I am declaring a maritime emergency and proceeding directly to Galveston Harbor. Our patient cannot survive a delay for search and rescue coordination. I will provide full cooperation with your investigation upon arrival at port. The radio silence that followed seemed to last forever. Finally, the Coast Guard response came. Gulf Navigator, your emergency declaration is acknowledged. Proceed to Galveston Harbor with Coast Guard escort. Be advised that a full investigation of the platform incident and missing crew member will commence upon your arrival. As Coast Guard cutter Resolute and her sister ships took up escort positions around the Gulf Navigator, I realized that my problems were just beginning. Getting the crew safely to port was only the first challenge. Explaining how I'd lost Tommy Chin and taken command of a commercial vessel without proper certification would be the next one. But Captain Morrison was still alive, the Gulf Navigator was still afloat, and Galveston Harbor was getting closer with every mile we traveled. For now, that had to be enough. The sight of Coast Guard vessels bracketing our position should have been reassuring, but instead it felt like a reminder of everything that had gone wrong during what should have been a routine diving operation. Coast Guard cutter Resolute, a 210-foot maritime security vessel, took up position off our starboard quarter while 2 smaller patrol boats maintained parallel courses to port and stern. Their presence provided professional search and rescue backup if our situation deteriorated further, but it also meant that every decision I made was being observed and evaluated by experienced Coast Guard officers who would be writing detailed reports about this incident. Marcus, the Coast Guard captain wants to speak with you directly, Lisa Park called from the radio station. She'd been monitoring communications traffic and coordinating with multiple agencies as word of our emergency spread through the maritime community. I keyed the microphone for what felt like the 100th time that day. Coast Guard cutter Resolute, this is Gulf Navigator Actual. Gulf Navigator, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell, Commanding Officer cutter Resolute. Can you provide a detailed briefing on the circumstances surrounding your missing crew member and the current condition of your medical emergency? The question forced me to confront the full scope of what had happened during the platform collapse. In the chaos of emergency navigation and medical crisis management, I hadn't had time to process the sequence of events that had led to Tommy Chen's death and Jake Morrison's heart attack. Now I had to provide a coherent account to a Coast Guard captain who would be determining whether criminal negligence or maritime safety violations had contributed to the disaster. Coast Guard Resolute, at approximately 0830 hours this morning, we experienced an unexpected seismic event while conducting routine platform inspection diving at Platform Delta 7. The earthquake triggered seafloor subsidence that caused catastrophic structural failure of the platform's northwest support leg. During the emergency, my dive partner Tommy Chen's umbilical was severed by falling debris, and we lost all contact with him. Captain Morrison suffered what appears to be a myocardial infarction during the emergency response and is currently unconscious but stable under medical care. Gulf Navigator, understood. Can you confirm that search and rescue efforts for the missing diver are not feasible given current conditions? This was the question I'd been dreading. Officially admitting that we'd abandoned search efforts for Tommy would require me to justify a decision that went against every principle of maritime rescue operations. But the truth was that continuing to search in the debris field would have been suicide for anyone else, and Tommy's severed umbilical meant he'd been without life support for over 4 hours. Coast Guard Resolute, the missing diver's umbilical was completely severed during the platform collapse. He was lost in a debris field with zero visibility and ongoing structural failure. No survival is possible given the circumstances and time elapsed. Captain Mitchell's response was professional but carried the weight of official authority. Gulf Navigator, that determination will be made by Coast Guard search and rescue coordinators based on full investigation of the incident. Continue to Galveston Harbor for medical emergency. Search operations will commence at Platform Delta 7 site immediately. I understood the Coast Guard's position perfectly. They couldn't simply accept my word that Tommy Chen was beyond rescue. They had legal and moral obligations to conduct thorough search operations whenever a commercial diver was reported missing. But I also knew that they would find nothing except debris and an underwater grave site that would be too dangerous for their own divers to enter. Mike Santos called from the engine room with news that added another layer of complexity to our situation. Marcus, we've got a problem with the starboard engine. Oil pressure's dropping and I'm seeing metal particles in the oil filter. I think we took more damage from the debris impact than we initially realized. The loss of one engine would cut our speed significantly and strain the remaining engine beyond its normal operating limits. More critically, it would leave us with no backup propulsion if the port engine also failed during the final approach to Galveston Harbor. How long can we run on one engine? Hard to say. The port engine's running fine, but it's going to be working twice as hard to maintain our current speed. In these sea conditions, I'd recommend reducing speed to maybe 6 knots to avoid overstressing the remaining engine. 6 knots would add another hour to our journey time, bringing our total transit to over 6 hours. Jenny Walsh had been clear that Morrison's cardiac condition could deteriorate rapidly if we didn't get him to advanced medical care within that time frame. I made another command decision that balanced competing risks. Maintain current speed on one engine and accept the possibility of complete propulsion failure, or reduce speed and risk losing our patient to delayed medical treatment. Mike, keep the port engine at current settings. Monitor it closely, but we need to maintain speed for the medical emergency. You got it, but I'll be surprised if this engine makes it all the way to port without problems. The weather continued to moderate as the cold front passed through our area, but the Gulf Navigator was handling differently with only one engine operational. The vessel's motion through the water became less predictable, requiring constant attention to steering and throttle control to maintain our course toward Galveston. Lisa Park had established regular communication schedules with both the Coast Guard escort and the emergency medical services waiting at Galveston Harbor. Her background growing up in a Coast Guard family had given her an understanding of emergency procedures that proved invaluable as our situation became more complex. Marcus, EMS coordinator in Galveston, wants to know Captain Morrison's current vital signs and medical history, she reported. They're setting up a cardiac team to meet us at the dock. Jenny Walsh provided a detailed medical briefing that painted a concerning picture of Morrison's condition. While he remained stable and unconscious, his blood pressure had been dropping steadily throughout our journey, and she was seeing occasional irregular heartbeats that suggested his cardiac function was deteriorating. I've given him everything I can with our onboard medical supplies, Jenny explained. He needs advanced life support and cardiac intervention that I simply can't provide out here. Every minute we delay getting him to a hospital reduces his chances of full recovery. The final 2 hours of our journey became a test of seamanship, engineering, and medical crisis management that pushed every member of our crew beyond their normal capabilities. Billy Tran and Carlos Mendez had taken over monitoring the damaged compartment, reporting water levels and bilge pump operations every 15 minutes. Despite the hull damage, the Gulf Navigator's pumping systems were keeping ahead of the water intrusion, but the situation remained precarious. "Marcus, I can see the Galveston Harbor entrance on radar," Mike announced as we approached the Texas coast. "About 12 miles out, but we've got another problem. The port engine is starting to show signs of strain, higher operating temperature and some vibration that wasn't there before." The approach to Galveston Harbor in a damaged vessel with a failing engine and a cardiac patient aboard represented the culmination of everything that had gone wrong since Tommy Chen and I had rolled off the dive platform that morning. As the harbor entrance came into view, I could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles lined up along the commercial docks, and a Coast Guard pilot boat racing out to meet us. "Gulf Navigator, this is Galveston Harbor Control. You are cleared for emergency docking at Pier 19. Harbor pilot vessel is en route to assist with your approach." The harbor pilot who came aboard was Captain Robert Davis, a weathered veteran who'd been guiding vessels into Galveston for over 30 years. His presence immediately reduced the stress level on the bridge as he took over the complex task of navigating the Gulf Navigator through the harbor channel with only one functioning engine. "First time bringing her in, son?" Captain Davis asked as he assessed our situation. "Yes, sir, and hopefully the last time under these circumstances. You did good getting her this far. The hard part's over. Now we just need to get her tied up so the medics can take care of your captain." The docking procedure that followed was a masterclass in professional seamanship. Captain Davis used the harbor's tugboats to assist our final approach, compensating for our reduced maneuverability with the skill that comes from decades of experience. As we approached Pier 19, I could see the organized chaos of emergency response. EMS teams with cardiac equipment, Coast Guard investigators with clipboards and cameras, and what appeared to be representatives from the platform operator's insurance company. "Gulf Navigator, this is EMS team leader. We're standing by to receive your cardiac patient. Can you provide final vital signs and current condition?" Jenny Walsh handled the medical briefing with the calm professionalism that had kept Morrison alive throughout our journey. As the EMS team boarded the vessel with their advanced cardiac equipment, she provided a detailed handoff that would ensure continuity of care during the transfer to the hospital. Captain Morrison regained consciousness briefly as the paramedics prepared him for transport. His eyes found mine across the crowded wheelhouse, and his voice was weak but clear. "Tommy?" I met his gaze and shook my head slightly. Morrison closed his eyes and nodded once, the acknowledgement of a captain who understood the cost of survival at sea. It was the last conversation we would have about the events of that day. As the ambulance departed with Morrison, Coast Guard investigators began the formal process of documenting the incident. Commander Patricia Vasquez, the lead investigator, was thorough but professional as she interviewed each crew member about the sequence of events that had led to the platform collapse and Tommy Chen's death. "Mr. Rodriguez, I need to understand your decision-making process regarding the missing diver and your assumption of command of this vessel," Commander Vasquez said as we sat in the Gulf Navigator's main salon. The investigation would continue for weeks, involving detailed analysis of the seismic data, platform structural engineering reports, and testimony from every crew member. But sitting in that salon, surrounded by the diving equipment and safety gear that had failed to bring Tommy home, I realized that the most important judgment had already been made. 5 people were alive who might not have been if different decisions had been made during those critical hours. The Coast Guard would ultimately determine that the platform collapse was caused by an unforeseeable geological event, that Tommy Chen's death was a tragic accident with no preventable causes, and that my assumption of command was justified by the emergency circumstances. But those official findings would come later, after weeks of investigation and analysis. That evening, as I sat in a Galveston hotel room waiting for my own family to arrive from Houston, I called Tommy Chen's parents in Plaquemines Parish to tell them that their son wasn't coming home. The phone call to Tommy Chen's family was the hardest conversation of my life. Sitting in a sterile hotel room overlooking Galveston Harbor, I struggled to find words that could possibly convey what had happened to their 24-year-old son during what should have been a routine day at work. Mrs. Chen answered on the second ring, and I could hear the hope in her voice when I identified myself as Tommy's dive partner. "Marcus, is Tommy with you? He was supposed to call yesterday evening, but we haven't heard from him." The silence that followed my explanation seemed to stretch for hours. Tommy's father took the phone and asked the questions that any parent would ask. Did he suffer? Could we have done anything differently? Will they find his body? I answered honestly, Tommy's death would have been instantaneous when his umbilical was severed. There was nothing anyone could have done to prevent the geological disaster that caused the platform collapse, and the likelihood of recovering his remains from the debris field was virtually zero. But honesty doesn't ease the pain of parents who've lost their only son to the sea. The official Coast Guard investigation lasted 6 weeks and involved examination of everything from seismic monitoring data to the maintenance records of Tommy's diving equipment. Commander Vasquez and her team reconstructed the sequence of events with scientific precision, ultimately concluding that Platform Delta 7's collapse was caused by a previously unknown geological fault line that had shifted during the magnitude 3.2 earthquake. The seismic event triggered localized seafloor subsidence that compromised the structural integrity of the northwest support leg, the official report stated. The subsequent platform collapse created conditions that were immediately life-threatening to personnel operating below the structure. The response of the dive team and vessel crew was consistent with established emergency procedures. What the report couldn't capture was the human cost of those established emergency procedures. Tommy Chen's name was added to the memorial wall at the International Association of Diving Contractors headquarters in Houston, joining the names of hundreds of other commercial divers who'd lost their lives in the pursuit of underwater industrial work. His family received a substantial settlement from the platform operator's insurance company, but money couldn't fill the space left by a son who'd chosen the dangerous profession of commercial diving to support his parents after Hurricane Katrina destroyed their fishing business. Captain Jake Morrison survived his heart attack and returned to commercial diving operations 6 months later, though he never again worked the deep Gulf platforms where structural failures could trigger the kind of cascade disaster we'd experienced. His recovery was complete from a medical standpoint, but I could see in his eyes that something had changed during those hours when he'd been unconscious and unable to command his vessel. "You did good that day, Rodriguez," he told me during one of his first visits back to the Gulf Navigator after his recovery. "Command decisions aren't made in classrooms or from textbooks. They're made when everything goes to hell and people are looking to you for answers you don't have." The Gulf Navigator herself was repaired and returned to commercial service within 3 months. The hull damage from Platform Delta 7's debris was more extensive than initially realized, requiring replacement of several steel plates and complete overhaul of the starboard propulsion system. But the vessel's basic structure had proven sound, and the damage was reparable rather than catastrophic. Lisa Park used her experience during the emergency to apply for admission to the Coast Guard Academy, where she's currently studying marine engineering and emergency response procedures. Mike Santos was promoted to chief engineer for the entire fleet of commercial diving vessels operated by our company, recognition of his critical role in keeping the Gulf Navigator operational during our emergency transit. Jenny Walsh completed additional emergency medical training and now serves as the primary medic for offshore operations throughout the Gulf of Mexico. Her calm professionalism during Morrison's cardiac emergency had undoubtedly saved his life, and her expertise has since been called upon during several other medical emergencies in the offshore oil industry. Billy Tran and Carlos Mendez continued working as deckhands on commercial diving vessels, though both men pursued additional safety training and emergency response certifications. The experience of nearly losing their vessel during a platform collapse had given them a deeper appreciation for the risks inherent in offshore industrial work. As for me, I made a decision that surprised everyone who knew me. I applied for and obtained a commercial vessel captain's license. The experience of commanding the Gulf Navigator during our emergency transit had revealed something about myself that I hadn't known existed: the ability to make life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure and accept responsibility for the consequences of those decisions. The licensing process required extensive study of navigation, maritime law, vessel operations, and emergency procedures. More importantly, it required me to analyze and learn from every mistake I'd made during that October day when everything went wrong. The Coast Guard examiners were particularly interested in my decision-making process regarding Tommy Chen's disappearance and my assumption of command without proper certification. "Maritime emergencies don't wait for proper paperwork," Chief Examiner Williams observed during my final licensing interview. "But they do require people who can make hard decisions quickly and live with the consequences. Based on your performance during the Platform Delta 7 incident, you've demonstrated those capabilities under actual emergency conditions." I now work as captain of a commercial diving support vessel operating throughout the Gulf of Mexico, specializing in deep-water platform inspections and emergency response operations. Every morning when I climb to the bridge and review weather conditions, navigation charts, and crew assignments, I think about Tommy Chin and the series of unforeseeable events that cost him his life. Commercial diving remains one of the most dangerous occupations in the world, with fatality rates that exceed those of deep-sea fishing, logging, and mining. Every year, the memorial wall at the Diving Contractors Association gains new names. Young men and women who chose to make their living in the hostile environment beneath the sea, where equipment failures, weather conditions, and geological events can turn routine operations into life-threatening emergencies. But for every name on that memorial wall, there are hundreds of commercial divers who complete their careers safely, returning home each evening to families who understand the risks but support their choice to work in one of the last truly adventurous professions. The offshore oil industry depends on these skilled professionals to maintain the infrastructure that provides energy for millions of people, and their work continues despite the inherent dangers. Platform Delta 7 was declared a total loss and was eventually removed from the seafloor by specialized salvage operations. The site where Tommy Chin died is now marked only by GPS coordinates and a notation on navigation charts warning of underwater obstructions. The geological fault that triggered the platform's collapse remains active, occasionally generating minor seismic events that are monitored by scientific instruments but pose no threat to current offshore operations. The Gulf of Mexico continues its ancient rhythm of storms and calms, its waters reflecting the same indifferent blue-green that has challenged mariners for centuries. Oil platforms rise from its depths like steel cathedrals, testament to human engineering and determination to extract resources from beneath the sea. Commercial divers descend daily into those depths, carrying on the work that Tommy Chin died performing. I still dive commercially, though now my perspective has changed from that of a crew member hoping someone else will make the difficult decisions to that of a captain who understands that leadership in maritime operations means accepting responsibility for outcomes you cannot always control. Every dive operation I supervise begins with detailed safety briefings, emergency procedures, and contingency planning designed to prevent the kind of cascade failure that destroyed Platform Delta 7. But the sea doesn't care about our safety procedures or contingency plans. It only cares about what we're strong enough to survive when everything goes wrong and the only resources available are the skills, equipment, and judgment we've brought with us into its depths. Tommy Chin was 24 years old when the Gulf of Mexico claimed him. A young man with dreams of starting his own diving company and enough skill to work alongside veterans like Morrison and myself. He deserved to grow old, to raise a family, to tell his own stories of adventures and close calls in the offshore oil fields. Instead, he became another reminder that the sea gives no guarantees and demands no explanations. The memorial service for Tommy was held at a small Catholic church in Plaquemines Parish, attended by commercial divers from across the Gulf Coast who understood that his death could just as easily have been their own. His parents asked me to speak about their son's final dive, and I struggled to find words that honored his memory without dwelling on the violent circumstances of his death. Tommy Chin died doing work that few people are brave enough or skilled enough to perform, I told the assembled mourners. He went into the water that morning to inspect the foundation of a structure that provided energy for thousands of families, and he approached that dangerous work with the professionalism and competence that made him a valued member of our diving team. His death was tragic and unforeseeable, but his life was dedicated to meaningful work performed with skill and courage. After the service, Tommy's father pulled me aside with a question that still haunts me. Could you have saved him if you'd tried? The honest answer is no. Tommy's umbilical had been severed by falling debris, and the continuing platform collapse made any rescue attempt suicidal for other divers. But the father of a dead son wasn't looking for technical explanations or Coast Guard investigation findings. He was looking for some assurance that everything possible had been done to bring his boy home. Sir, if there had been any way to reach Tommy safely, we would have tried. But the conditions down there were beyond anything we'd ever trained for, and staying in that area would have cost more lives without any possibility of saving his. Mr. Chin nodded and shook my hand, but I could see in his eyes that no explanation would ever be sufficient to justify his loss. Parents who send their children to work in dangerous professions live with fears that most people never have to confront. And when those fears become reality, there are no words that can provide comfort. The offshore oil industry has continued to evolve since the Platform Delta 7 incident, with improved seismic monitoring systems and enhanced structural engineering designed to prevent similar catastrophic failures. But the fundamental reality of commercial diving remains unchanged: human beings working in an environment that is inherently hostile to human life, using equipment and procedures that can fail without warning, performing tasks that are essential to modern industrial civilization. Every commercial diver understands these risks and accepts them as part of the profession they've chosen. We mitigate the dangers through training, equipment, and procedures, but we cannot eliminate them entirely. The sea will always be stronger than our technology, more patient than our planning, and more indifferent than our hopes. Tommy Chen's death taught me that leadership in maritime operations isn't about having all the answers or making perfect decisions under pressure. It's about accepting responsibility for outcomes you cannot control and making the best decisions possible with incomplete information and limited resources. Sometimes those decisions save lives and sometimes they don't, but the obligation to make them remains regardless of the consequences. I carry that obligation every time I take command of a vessel, every time I brief a dive team, every time I make decisions that affect the safety of people who have trusted me with their lives. Tommy Chen's death was a tragedy that couldn't have been prevented, but it taught me lessons about leadership and responsibility that have made me a better captain and, I hope, a better man. The Gulf of Mexico is still out there, vast and indifferent, ready to test anyone brave enough or foolish enough to make their living on her waters. Commercial divers will continue to descend into her depths, carrying on work that is dangerous, essential, and poorly understood by most of the people who benefit from their efforts. Some of them will not return, adding their names to memorial walls and their stories to the oral tradition of offshore workers who understand that the sea gives no guarantees. But for those who do return, carrying the tools and skills and scars that mark them as people who work beneath the surface of the ocean, there is a satisfaction that comes from performing difficult work competently and safely. There is pride in maintaining the infrastructure that modern civilization depends upon, and there is camaraderie among people who share risks that others cannot imagine. Tommy Chen died as part of that community, and his memory lives on in the stories told by commercial divers who understand that every day they return safely from the depths is a day they've cheated the sea of another victim. His death was senseless and tragic, but his life was meaningful and his work was important, and that has to be enough to honor his memory and justify the continued risks that others accept in carrying on the profession he died performing. The sea doesn't care what we think is fair or just or reasonable. It only cares what we're strong enough to survive. Tommy Chen wasn't strong enough to survive Platform Delta 7's collapse, but his death taught the rest of us lessons about courage, competence, and the acceptance of risk that make us better at the dangerous work we've chosen to perform. That has to be enough because it's all we have. The sea gives no explanations and accepts no excuses, but it does reward those who approach its challenges with skill, preparation, and the kind of courage that Tommy Chen demonstrated every time he rolled backward off a dive platform into the green depths of the Gulf of Mexico. His story ends in tragedy, but it also stands as testament to the bravery of people who choose to work where others fear to venture, performing tasks that are essential to modern life but invisible to most of the people who benefit from their efforts. Commercial diving will continue, platforms will continue to rise from the depths, and young men and women will continue to accept the risks that come with working beneath the surface of the sea. Some of them will not come home, but their sacrifice ensures that others can live with the benefits of energy extracted from beneath the ocean floor. That is the bargain that commercial divers make with the sea, and it is a bargain that Tommy Chen honored with his life and his death. The Gulf of Mexico is vast, indifferent, and eternal. But the courage of people like Tommy Chen, who dare to challenge its depths in service of civilization's needs, is equally eternal and far more meaningful than the cold waters that claimed his life.